Let's start our healthy cherry almond scones by mixing our dry ingredients in a bowl. I've got 2 cups of flour swap, 1/2 cup of granular sugar swap, 1 teaspoon of fine salt, and 1 tablespoon of baking powder. If you're making these grain-free, go ahead and increase your baking powder to about 1.5 tablespoons. Now we'll mix our wet ingredients. I've got 1 egg swap. So this is 1/2 cup of very hot water, 2 tablespoons of egg swap powder. There's 1/2 cup of unsweetened plant milk. I usually use almond milk. 1/2 cup of well-stirred room temperature butter swap. If you have trouble stirring your butter swap, just pour the entire container into a blender and blend on high. It'll stay nice and smooth that way. We'll mix in our flavor extract. So we've got 1 tablespoon of pure vanilla. So 1 teaspoon of pure almond extract. I love the smell of almond extract. Now we're going to mix our wet and dry ingredients really well. This first demonstration is using the grain-free flour swap, so you're going to get a nice, thick, crumbly dough out of this one. And then in a moment, I'll compare the whole grain dough, how that looks. Now I'm going to get in here, knead the dough with my hands now that it's well mixed. See how the dough is fairly crumbly. Now we're going to let our dough rest for about 5 minutes, let the rest of the fiber absorb the moisture. Now we'll put 1/2 cup of slivered or sliced almonds works well, and 1/2 cup of unsweetened dried cherries. Go ahead and coarsely chop your cherries if they're big. Now using a flat paddle or your hands, it's going to be better with our hands, we'll just go ahead and fold in the cherries and almonds until they're nicely dispersed throughout our dough. Now here's my whole grain flour swap. You can see it's still very thick, just like a normal scone dough is going to look, yet it's not quite as crumbly. This dough is actually going to handle much more like a regular white flour, white sugar scone dough. So I'm just folding in my dried cherries and my slivered sliced almonds. Perfect. We'll line a baking tray with parchment paper. And then first I'm going to work with my whole grain dough. Make a big ball in the center of your baking tray. And then we're going to use our clean hands to form a nice round circle. And we're going for about 1 inch thick. Now we're going to cut our scone dough in 8 equal parts. And because this dough is pretty thick and sticky, I've wet my knife, which helps. Now just pull your scones slightly apart on the baking tray so they have room to bake and expand. There's a lot of baking powder in this recipe, so they are going to expand and spread, but they'll hold their shape well. If you need to reform them just a little bit so they look pretty, go ahead, now's your chance. I've got my oven preheating to 400 degrees. I'm going to bake these at 400 for 10 minutes, and then I will turn down the oven to 350 degrees, and I'll bake the whole grain for an additional 8 to 9 minutes. I'm going to do the same process with my grain-free scones, but you can see how much more crumbly this dough is. So go ahead and transfer it onto your parchment paper. And again, we're going to form that nice circle about 1 inch thick. You can see I'm really using my hands, pressing down firmly, making sure the dough is nice and compact, and working a little bit harder to make this into a pretty circle, but it's coming together fine. All that healthy fiber in the psyllium husk is what holds it together. I will pull them apart and then reshape whatever we need to make sure they look pretty for our final baking. Just going to press the cherries and the almonds back in, the ones that fell, no big deal. And these will expand as they bake, but not as much as the whole grain ones. And these scones are so good. They're actually my favorite when you do half and half flour. So 1 cup of whole grain with 1 cup of grain-free. And they won't be quite this crumbly and thick. And I just think the flavor and texture is the best when you combine the flours, and that's true for most detox desserts. All right, these are looking good. So we're gonna bake these at 400 for about 10 minutes, and then these will bake at, then turn down the oven and bake for an additional 10 to 12 minutes. And watch these closely, we don't want them to burn. So if you need to turn them down to 350 before that 10-minute interval, go ahead and do that. Cool your scones on a wire rack. Now, my grain-free scones actually, they started browning way too early, so I turned down the oven, and they're not bad. So I turned down the oven to 350 before the 10 minutes. So make sure you watch your grain-free close. The whole grain holds up really well. These baked 10 minutes at 400 and then an additional 9 minutes at 350. We're gonna make a really easy glaze for our cooled scones. So we're gonna use 1/4 of a teaspoon of almond extract, mixed with just a little bit of water until we get a nice smooth consistency. Now we have 1/2 cup of powdered sugar swap in a bowl, and then we'll just slowly add our water until we have a nice drippy, smooth consistency to top our scones with. This looks like it's going to be just about perfect. Always use hot water when you're mixing. The powdered sugar swap has a kind of a cooling effect, so the hot fluid is needed to balance out that cooling effect. Perfect. See, nice smooth, drippy consistency. It's going to look beautiful and taste delicious on our scones. Make sure you fill all these little crevices on the top with the glaze. Just let it drip down the sides. It's going to harden as it sits. So we'll just leave these little beauties out for a couple hours and let the icing fully harden before we pack them up in a sealed container in the refrigerator. I'm just going to put a few sliced almonds on top and let those harden into the glaze.